Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the really fascinating evolution of U.S. foreign policy, and specifically, the constitutional tug-of-war that actually drives it. From the price of gas at your local station to the reality of global security, the decisions made in Washington ripple through literally every aspect of our daily lives. So if you've ever wondered how the gears of government actually turn when it comes to international relations, well, you're in exactly the right place. We're going to look at the history, the core documents, and the defining moments that shaped America's role in the world. Okay, let's just tackle this essential question right off the bat. How did 13 isolated colonies become a global superpower? I mean, think about it for a second. It's a pretty crazy leap, isn't it? Going from just a handful of isolated English settlements clustered on the eastern seaboard back in the 17th century to the absolute most powerful nation on Earth. The answer to how that actually happened isn't just about having military might or a booming economy. It's deeply rooted in the very political system this nation was built upon. To make sense of over 2 centuries of history, we're breaking this explainer down into 6 distinct parts. 1. Foundations and early neutrality. 2. Expansion and civil war. 3. World wars and global power. 4. The Cold War standoff. 5. The post-Cold War era. And finally, number 6, tools of U.S. foreign policy. Let's get to it. All right, Section 1, Foundations and Early Neutrality. Let's look at the rules of the game established right after the American Revolution. So the 1787 Constitution didn't just give one person the keys to the kingdom. Actually, the founders were absolutely terrified of creating another King George, right? So they intentionally set up this complex system of checks and balances to prevent a monarchy in disguise. The president gets the authority to act as commander-in-chief and to negotiate treaties. But Congress? Well, they hold the power of the purse, the power to regulate foreign trade, and, crucially, the power to officially declare war and ratify those treaties. This deliberate division ensures no single branch can just unilaterally decide the nation's global stance. It's a built-in constitutional tug-of-war designed to be difficult, kind of forcing a compromise before the country can commit to anything abroad. For the first century of its existence, the U.S. leaned heavily on the principle of isolationism to protect its sovereignty and, honestly, its pretty limited resources. The main goal here was incredibly simple: minimize reliance on European powers and just stay out of their endless conflicts. It was a super practical response for a young, developing nation that desperately needed to focus inward on its own stability and economic growth. And let's not forget the geography here. The Atlantic Ocean literally served as this giant, incredibly convenient moat, making this whole inward-looking policy totally viable. Fast forward a bit to 1793, and President George Washington issues the Proclamation of Neutrality. Now, this is fascinating. He essentially invents a form of executive privilege right on the spot to keep the U.S. out of a massive war brewing between France and Britain. He didn't even wait for congressional approval. He just flat-out declared the nation neutral. He knew the fledgling country would get crushed under the weight of a major European conflict, so he set this definitive tone for non-involvement that would successfully guide American foreign policy for decades. The young nation secured its independence and immediately set a really powerful precedent for executive-led neutrality. Moving on to Section 2, Expansion and Civil War. Let's jump into the 19th century and see how this all builds as the nation starts looking westward. As the nation industrialized, the imagination of the American public was totally captured by this powerful, almost radical ideology known as Manifest Destiny. The belief here was that expanding from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast wasn't just some political goal, it was actually viewed as a divine right. And this fueled massive, massive territorial growth. It was also hugely aided by rapid technological advances. Think of the Transcontinental Railroad acting as a giant physical zipper, permanently joining the coasts at a staggering pace and transforming these vast, wild frontiers into connected states. Now, while the U.S. was busy avoiding European wars, it still confidently asserted leadership in its own backyard. With the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, the U.S. essentially put up a giant no trespassing sign for European powers across the entire Western Hemisphere. It basically declared that, hey, while America wouldn't meddle in European affairs, Europe was no longer welcome to colonize North or South America. It was a bold executive move completely backed by Congress, asserting regional dominance and protecting those newly independent nations down south. Despite some really massive domestic crises, the nation's borders and overall influence just continually expanded. Look at the sheer volume of growth here. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson nearly doubled the country's size with the Louisiana Purchase. But what's super interesting about this is that Jefferson, who was a really strict constitutionalist, actually agonized over whether he legally had the power to buy that land without a constitutional amendment. Ultimately, the strategic value just outweighed his hesitation. This perfectly highlights that ever-present tension between executive action and the strict letter of the Constitution. Following that, we see conflicts like the Mexican-American War over Texas. And even during the intense racial and political strife of the antebellum period, which, of course, culminated in the horrific tragedy of the Civil War, the overarching trajectory of the United States was still one of relentless geographical and economic expansion. All right, Section 3, World Wars and Global Power. As we hit the turn of the 20th century, the pace really accelerates, and America officially steps onto the global stage.
The turn of the century brought a massive shift. The U.S. pivoted from just acquiring neighboring territories to actually fighting global conflicts alongside allied powers. The Spanish-American War in 1898 saw the U.S. acquire overseas territories like Puerto Rico and the Philippines, stepping into a role that frankly looked a lot more like a traditional imperial power. Then, American involvement in World War I totally cemented its status as a major global military force. But it was really this shocking, devastating attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 that served as a massive psychological wake-up call. It definitively shattered any remaining illusions of isolationism, plunging the U.S. directly into World War II and forever changing its trajectory on the world stage.
Now, the aftermath of World War I perfectly captures that constitutional tug-of-war we've been talking about, right in action. President Woodrow Wilson championed the creation of the League of Nations to ensure global peace. This was a highly ambitious, executive-led foreign policy. But the Senate? Well, reflecting a public desire to return to isolationism and honestly terrified of losing American sovereignty to an international body, they flat out rejected it. It's a profound irony, really. Wilson championing a global alliance across the world only to be entirely defeated by his own Senate right at home. It's a stark reminder that the president absolutely does not just have a blank check. Okay, Section 4, the Cold War Standoff. World War II firmly ended American isolationism once and for all, launching us directly into the Cold War era. Let's see how the political machinery adapted. Driven by this new strategy of containment, executive power expanded massively. The singular goal here was to stop the global spread of the Soviet Union's influence, period. To actually execute this, the U.S. passed the National Security Act of 1947, creating the National Security Council and the CIA. Think about this. This move effectively gave the president a standing global shadow army. The executive branch now had incredibly powerful tools to act quickly, conduct covert operations, and respond to existential threats in real time without having to constantly rely on standard congressional declarations of war. The balance of power shifted heavily toward the presidency because, well, the Cold War demanded rapid, decisive action. But, the pendulum always swings back. Following massive public frustration over the Vietnam War, Congress slammed on the brakes. For years, presidents had been committing hundreds of thousands of troops to massive, bloody conflicts without formal declarations of war. So Congress struck back with the War Powers Resolution of 1973 to firmly reassert its authority over war-making. This required the president to consult Congress and set a strict 60-day clock to withdraw troops unless Congress explicitly authorized the action. It was a huge institutional effort to rein in the commander-in-chief. Section 5, the post-Cold War era. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the U.S. emerged as the world's sole superpower. In this unipolar era, U.S. priorities shifted from containing communism to tackling a totally complex web of global issues. In response to events like the 9/11 attacks, Congress passed broad authorizations for the use of military force, or AUMFs. But here's the catch. These authorizations essentially became a new kind of blank check. Presidents ended up using them for decades across multiple countries to conduct counterterrorism operations. It really shows just how drastically the balance of power can tilt back toward the executive branch in times of ongoing, persistent crisis. We saw a huge surge in the president acting independently, often relying on executive agreements to completely bypass that rigorous, slow process of Senate ratification. Finally, Section 6, Tools of U.S. Foreign Policy. Now that we've traced the history and this constant constitutional tension, let's examine the actual mechanics and tools used to execute these global strategies today. So whether we're using diplomacy, economic sanctions, or military force, there are four main pillars that consistently guide American actions abroad. Literally everything the government does internationally maps back to one of these: national security, international trade, promoting world peace, and promoting democracy and human rights. But of course, in the real world, it's rarely that simple. Sometimes promoting human rights might directly conflict with maintaining a highly lucrative trade deal, or ensuring national security might complicate efforts to promote world peace. And that is exactly where the policy gets incredibly messy and the internal debates really start to heat up.
to actually execute these policies on the ground, the president relies on this massive, complex institutional machinery. The Department of State acts as the diplomatic phase, right? They're out there negotiating and implementing policy peacefully around the globe. Then you have the Department of Defense providing the muscle, maintaining a vast global military presence for quick crisis response. And the National Security Council sits right at the top, advising the president and coordinating all this intelligence to ensure these massive, totally distinct departments are actually rowing in the exact same direction.
Today, the United States manages relations with nearly 200 sovereign nations. Honestly, it's a breathtaking logistical feat. To manage ties with that many countries requires an incredibly complex web of alliances, like NATO, massive economic systems, like the IMF, and constant everyday diplomatic engagement through the United Nations. It is a massive, ongoing 24/7 operation that requires a very delicate balance of power back home just to sustain it. Quite a long way from those original 13 isolated colonies, huh? So, as great power rivalries with countries like China and Russia heat up today, and borderless, transnational issues like cyber warfare and climate change take center stage, it's really worth considering how this historic tension between the president and Congress is going to shape our future. Will the executive branch continue to dominate as these fast-paced crises demand quicker, more unified responses? Or is Congress going to find new ways to pull the reins and firmly reassert its voice? This constitutional tug-of-war we've explored today isn't just history textbooks, it's happening right now, in real time, shaping the world of tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.